Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's guest, Jordan Alexander. How are you doing, Jordan?
I'm really well, thank you, Alex, and thank you for having me here today. It's a great experience and a wonderful opportunity.
No, thank you. I'm so glad we were able to connect, and I'm really looking forward to this chat. Why don't you introduce yourself, I suppose, because you're the head or the chair of the National Working Group on Spiritual and Ritual Abuse. Is that the right term for it? How would you?
Chair,
Yeah.
yeah, chairperson, not the head necessarily,
Okay.
but certainly the chairperson. So yeah, my name's Jordan Alexander. I'm the chair of the National Working Group for Spiritual and Ritual Abuse. Previous to this, I've worked within safeguarding for about 25 years now, whether it be child abuse, adults at risk, domestic abuse, modern slavery and trafficking, FGM, honor-based abuse, and spiritual abuse was something that I came across quite accidentally around 2014 when a case landed on my desk and it involved a boy that had been taken for a ritual that was deemed to be harmful, but there was no further information. And I was really between a rock and a hard place because all of my training had said, well, the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act says that we all have the right to believe in whatever we want to believe in. So how can I go and knock on someone's door and saying you're putting your child at risk through what it might be your beliefs without offending someone or even breaking the law, but while also having the primacy goal of safeguarding a child? And through that, I found the National Working Group. National Working Group was set up in 2011 by Tim Lawton, MP, who I believe at the time was the Children's Minister. I might be wrong on that one. And I went on to the National Working Group, and it was made up of about 6 or 7 agencies at the time, and they were all put together through Parliament to bring around greater awareness of, as it was called then, child abuse linked to faith or belief. And that was following the deaths of children in the UK through ritual procedures like Victoria Colombier, who was accused of being a witch, Christy Bamu, who died in 2010 for, again, being accused of being a witch, or Kindoki. And so Parliament put together this group of agencies to try and bring greater awareness. And I went along and I got some really good advice about how to proceed and how to approach a subject. And it worked really well. I was able to safeguard that young boy from being harmed, and while also learning a lot. And then all of a sudden, it was like a can of worms opened up because more and more cases seem to get reported where children are at risk of spiritual or ritual abuse, and they became known as Jordan jobs. And they all came my way. Oh, you've dealt with this before. Here, you can have this one again. And for the next couple of years, that's pretty much what I did. And then in 2017, I had quite a significant breakthrough with an investigation, again involving a young boy. He'd gone to school and he had marks all over his back. And the PE teacher, and we'll call him Tom just to keep him anonymous. That's not his real name. And the PE teacher said, "Oh, Tom, what's happened to your back there, buddy?" And he went, "Oh, don't worry about it, boss. Dad got devil out of me last weekend." And that PE teacher had an option of like going, well, Tom seems okay, he's happy and chatty, so maybe there's no worry. Instead, he did a referral and it came in, it landed on my desk again. And with social services, we did a joint agency visit. And Tom was happy and chatty, very positive young boy. Don't worry about it, honestly, right? I had this thing living inside me, and my dad got it out of me. And then we went to this place, and he got it, and I feel much better now. So Tom wasn't realizing as a young boy that he had been abused through these. It was a bloodletting ritual to allow the demon to exit the body by bleeding him. And as a safeguarding professional, even I had the choice right there and then of, well, he doesn't appear abused. He's happy and chatty. So where's the abuse? But then you have to remember the Victoria Columbia investigation, and one of the key learnings from that was that a lot of safeguarding professionals ignored the opportunity to safeguard Victoria because she was also happy and chatty, despite turning up at hospital covered in bruises and burns, starved. They said, well, she's happy and chatty, where's the abuse? That case we took forward, and we did an investigation into that shop. As it was on Burnley in the High Street in Lancashire, right next to WH Smith's. And for around £500, you could take your children here and have the same procedure done. And we arrested the father who had taken the child there, and also the shop owner, or the witch doctor, as he preferred to be called, or practitioner. And immediately on interview, the father said, "You can't challenge us our beliefs. You know, you can't question our beliefs. We know our rights." And he had a good point, because as per the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act, you can't interfere with people's beliefs. You know, they're protected characteristics. And I said, "You're absolutely right. But I'm not here to challenge your beliefs. I'm here to challenge the fact that you're committing child abuse and you're using your beliefs to justify that abuse." And that was the avenue that we took with that investigation. That investigation went to court, and in 2017, the judge, after a lot of discussions, allowed for the full facts of the case to be heard for the jury. Initially, he said, and I quote, "Don't want this hocus pocus in my courtroom." Um, and it was a barrier. And we pushed and pushed, and he said, okay, when he conceded, we were brought in as expert witnesses, given the cases that we worked on. And the outcome of that, after 3.5 week trial, was that the father and the witch doctor were both found guilty of child abuse, where spiritual abuse was found to be the aggravating factor. And that was a landmark case, because it opened up the floodgates of litigation and awareness, and all of a sudden papers started reporting on it. Cases started coming to our attention, like Aisha Ali in 2017 as well, and more has been happening. I then went on to work as a director of safeguarding for a small charity, and during my time there, the opportunity to become chair of the national working group came up. And I thought, oh, do I want this? Can I do anything about it? And I thought, actually, no, I had all these ideas about what to do with the national working group and taking it a different direction, recognizing adults and children, understanding the greater complexities of how, you know, it's embedded within modern slavery and exploitation, as well as domestic abuse and child abuse. And yeah, I was put forward and nominated, and I've been chair since 2022.
Wow,
So yeah,
amazing.
that's a nutshell.
Yeah, and obviously I attended one of these meetings of the National Working Group. The last one that was it last month, the month before? It goes so quickly.
Yeah.
And it seems like really good work is being done there. There was a lot of different representatives from different groups talking about, you know, the challenges that you know the country faces, and the societal changes and the legislative changes that are needed to combat this, because as you say, it's a delicate balance between your human right and freedom of belief, and you know the consequences of enacting those beliefs in some circumstances. What are the, like, what powers, I suppose, does the National Working Group have, or like where does it sit in terms of the framework of actually driving that change?
Wow. Okay. We have no powers. Let's get that clear on the table. We have no powers. It was created by Parliament in 2011, and this was one of the reasons I wanted to become chairperson, because by 2020, Parliament were nowhere to be seen. You'll recall in the previous government, ministers were changing roles every 6 months, every year. I think we had like 5 Home Secretaries, 12, ministers for this, and so we couldn't keep up with who was actually leading on safeguarding or child protection issues or adult at risk issues, and it was just changing every day. And we really want to strive forward to give people greater opportunity to be safeguarded, and that's one of the key factors of me taking the chair position. And one of the things that we're trying to do through working in partnership, and it's important to know that when I took over actually as chairperson, there was around 12 organisations involved in the National Working Group. We now have 103. So one of the key factors I want to do was open up the doors and say everyone needs to be involved in what we're doing, including faith organisations. And one of the biggest wins I feel I've accomplished is having the Church of England and the Catholic Church both part of the National Working Group. And we can share best practice ideas, how to safeguard people, influence policies and procedures of organisations, and so they can hear from us, and vice versa, and that flow of information. One of the other areas we want to do as well is raise greater awareness. So we held a conference for the first time ever last year, which was predominantly funded by my own company, Prism Training, but also by the University of Lancaster, to bring survivors the opportunity to come and tell you their stories in an open forum. And that was, again, a really big hit for creating that greater awareness. But now now we've got the awareness, now we've got that momentum, it's time to bring about significant positive change. And one of the key changes I'm really looking forward to is an amendment to the Serious Crime Act 2015, where controlling coercive behaviour was brought about being recognised a few years ago. However, you can only be controlled or coerced at present by law if you're in a domestic setting, which translates as a partner, ex-partner, or immediate family member. So a school teacher can control and coerce you. A sports coach can control and coerce you. A spiritual leader can control and coerce you. And what we've missed, or what this government's missed out on the opportunity, is at the moment, anyone who is abused by a spiritual leader, for example, as we saw with the recent publications of what happened with Justin Welby, you have to wait until you are physically, sexually, or financially abused before anyone can do anything. And we say no. It's time for legislation changes so that when someone is being at that stages of manipulation, controlling, coercive, that invisible form of abuse that isn't tangible, they can report it and get safeguarded, get protected, and be prevented from it becoming sexual, physical, or financial. And one of the good examples, I think, is from what happened with Justin Welby. And the day after that happened, I remember watching one of the survivors talking on This Morning with Richard Madeley. And he's our similar age brackets, and he was saying that up until in his 20s, the person was abusing him every week, and he kept on going back. And Richard Madeley, probably wrongly, said, "Well, why did you let that happen?" So not very victim-led question. Why did you let that happen? And I cringed when I heard that. But the answer that came back was brilliant, because that person said, because they told me that's what God wanted. They had controlled and coerced me to such a level to make me believe that that's what God wanted. God wanted me to be sexually abused. God wanted me to be physically punished, that I didn't question it. I didn't think to question it. Just imagine if that same person had the opportunity to realize they were being controlled and coerced at a much earlier stage in their life and report it, and that could have prevented and protected them from being sexually and physically abused for a significant part of their life thereafter. And that's what we want. We want to bring that positive change so that people can be safeguarded from further abuse at an early stage. And at the moment, that's only limited to people in domestic abuse situations.
So it's really important that that work is done to amend the legislation so that its application is a little bit broader, in order to safeguard people. But I think there's also a challenge there around how do you enforce that safeguarding. I brought up the point at the last meeting of the National Working Group was, it wasn't specifically about Scientology, but it's about, if you have a mandated reporting situation, for example, if a priest or a religious leader is aware of some sort of abuse happening to a child, they have to report it to law enforcement, and therefore it will be investigated and handled. Well, in a cultic situation, for example, in Scientology, your religious belief, or so-called religious belief, prohibits you from reporting anything to law enforcement. In fact, you'll be punished if you report another Scientologist to law enforcement. So it's all very well and good saying, yes, you have to report abuse and that's now the law, but it's another thing to actually get these coercive groups to actually enforce that legislation. And I think that is a particularly difficult challenge that perhaps you won't face with larger organizations that are perhaps more compliant and willing to engage with law enforcement. What are your thoughts on that particular challenge, and has that been thought about or considered by the National Working Group, or is it too early because you're still fighting for the legislative change, right?
No, I was actually at the reading of the ICSA report in Parliament, and it was really interesting because Professor Alexis J, I should say, who compiled that report, gave her sort of summary and understanding of what happened through that. And one of the key learnings she said, and she started off, I remember, really strong, and she said, faith organizations, they have got to basically step up and change their ways. And she made comments to one or two safeguarding companies in the same respect of their procedures not being um, in line with national standards. And then mandatory reporting got brought up actually as a key subject. So there's some MPs there. And it was interesting because mandatory reporting has been around for a while. It came in a few years ago. I know it's been reinforced recently for child survivors of, or suspected child survivors of sexual abuse. And there's now a custodial sentence attached to someone if you don't report that. But this has actually been around for a while in terms of all child safeguarding, but it's never been tested. So, and we know from cases we've seen in the papers, especially regarding child safeguarding, that things have gone missed. There was a case recently in Bradford of the child called Star who was killed, and I think findings already have found that there was 7 referrals to children's services for concerns for that child's safety and welfare. Well, where's the people who were accountable for receiving those referrals and not acting? Where's the justice? The powers have been there to make people accountable. At some stage, the government, whichever government it is, has got to make an example and show that they mean what they say. You can't just put something in place like mandatory reporting and saying, oh, this is fantastic, we've got this, everyone's safeguarded, because they're not. You've got to show you mean business. You've got to show people that there are consequences to ignoring safeguarding concerns. And until that happens, in my personal opinion, mandatory reporting, it's just a piece of paper with more words on it. That's a sticking plaster. It's not doing anything yet, because people can't see that there are serious, fearful consequences. And until we do see someone, sadly being sentenced, being sentenced for failing to report something from a statutory agency like Children's Services or police, or failing to act, then unfortunately, again, it's potentially it's just a piece of paper that's not really got any sort of gravitas to it. From the National Working Group point of view, we would like to see that extended to all people who are at risk of safeguarding, not just children. Often we find, as with legislation and most initiatives, it always starts with children. We saw the Care Act in 2004, which came about as a result of Victoria Columbier's death, and that was about sharing information between agencies and to make sure things were done properly. But that didn't reflect on adults until 2014, nearly 10 years later, when the Care Act came about, and that was only as a result of people failing to report and act on adults who were at risk as well. But again, all we have is there's a child safeguarding mandatory reporting, but there's still nothing for adults who may be at risk of this abuse. So we'd like to see it go one step further. Children, yes, I'm a firm believer we should protect children. I also believe we should protect all adults as well, because we sometimes have this stereotype that, well, an adult can protect themselves, an adult can say no. Sadly, not all of them do. I've worked in safeguarding for 25 years, and I have worked with so many adults who don't know how to say no. We had a really interesting case not so long ago with the National Working Group that we weighed in on, with a police force in the UK. I can't say which one, but it involved a lady who had sought out an exorcism, and she'd gone down to a local priest and said, "Oh, I think I'm possessed. What do I do?" And he went, "Oh, yes, you are possessed." And I'm paraphrasing, by the way. This isn't exactly word for word. It's just for the purpose of this. And he charged her £84,000 for that exorcism. He told her that the demons lived within her genitals, and therefore he had to perform certain sexual acts on her. All the time, she thought that this was a normal exorcism procedure. Yeah, because why would she argue it? She, like me and you, we don't really know what exorcisms really look like. So she went along with it, and then she realized it was wrong. It didn't feel right, and she reported it to the police, and the police went, "Sorry, you gave consent, not our problem." And through that, she reached out to myself in the National Working Group, and we were like, no, you've consented to what you thought was an exorcism. You didn't consent to being sexually or financially exploited. And we got back in touch with that police force. And I've got to say, positive, they did reopen the case within 24 hours. It became an operation. I believe that 6 more women have been identified who have been through the same exploitation with this priest. But the biggest factor here was the religious organization that employed that priest, excuse me, who were part of the National Working Group, who really helped support the police investigation. And that's what we do at National Working Group. We bring together partner agencies to make sure that survivors get the best possible support they can, and that they're not left trying to figure out how to support themselves on their own or how to fight their own victims of crime.
Yeah, I think that's really, really positive work. And that's why I'm so happy to have met you and come across the National Working Group, because this is exactly what we need here in the UK. Because I think education is something that's really, really important. And, from my limited, I've only been an activist talking out about my experience in Scientology and others for like 2 years, so I'm still very, very new to this, but already it's become very apparent to me that there is a real lack of understanding and education around coercive control, around abuse, and particularly with regard to cults, how they actually work. For example, if a child is brought up in Scientology, they don't know anything different, so they're not aware of what is and isn't acceptable by the general society around them, and what is and isn't legal, because their understanding of the world is based on what they've been told by Scientology. And so, for example, the purification rundown is the first major thing you do in Scientology, and it involves taking thousands of milligrams of niacin and other vitamins, sitting in a sauna for 5 hours a day for several weeks. The concept behind it is that you take these vitamins and they loosen up these toxins that are stored in your fatty tissue, and you sit in the sauna to sweat them out, and it's a cleansing ritual almost. There's no scientific basis behind any of it, and people have actually died doing this purification rundown over in the United States. Fortunately, I'm not aware of any deaths that have happened here in the UK, but nonetheless, it is the first step that any Scientologist has to do on their so-called bridge to total freedom. And it's a dangerous thing to put, especially a child, through. And for example, when this was reported to the police and said, hey, look, there are children doing this specific thing at St. Hill, Scientology's UK headquarters. And the children, if you go there, will be saying, yes, they consent to it. Yeah, we're happy to do it. Our parents have told us we have to. And this is great. It's going to cleanse me. It's going to set me up for life and all of this. But that doesn't mean it's not therefore abusive and harmful to the children. And the police kind of said, well, look, there's not really much we can do because the children are happy. There's no signs of abuse. They're just taking vitamins. It's not like they're taking hard narcotics or anything. What's the harm? And it's a real push for me to try and educate the police on exactly what you were just saying about, the nature of abuse. But it's a difficult challenge.
I mean, you've just hit a nail on the head there. So, in the well over 100 and odd investigations that I've managed myself, and then hundreds more that I've been involved in as either as consulting or been brought in as an advisor, one of the key things I always say to people is, like in that case, how do you know the vitamins? How do you know, as a police officer, that those are vitamins? Have you been and tested them? How do you know they're not something else? Because it could easily be. But also, we need to get past this barrier of, well, the children are happy and chatty. I hear this so often and it drives me insane. We saw it recently on the case in Scotland, in Glasgow, that went to sentencing just a few weeks ago, involving a number of children who were abused through spiritual means. They were being sexually abused over Ouija boards and seances. They were being forced to believe that the adults could turn them into dogs. There would be animal sacrifices to reinforce just how powerful those adults were. So these children were terrified, but again, they didn't know any different. They thought this was life. These were children who were then being forced to run county lines, who were, one child was put in a microwave, another child, I believe, was put into a fridge freezer. The details of that story are truly shocking. And all the time, these children were described, and I quote again, happy and chatty, no safeguarding concerns. Now, the Scottish government, as a result of this case, because it went on for 8 years, did the abuse, and the Scottish government knew about it very early on because all these children were on child protection plans, so they were being closely monitored and supervised, but they were happy and chatty. So why be bothered? If the child looks happy, there's no abuse. Wrong. Yeah. If you know that someone's being abused, as a regulated professional, especially, you have a duty. And this is where mandatory reporting, I think, is going to really hopefully come into its own, because at some point we're going to have another big case like this. Despite what the Scottish police have said, there's a superintendent from safeguarding who went online and said, this is a rare case. This sort of thing just doesn't happen. Those are the exact same words that were used right after Victoria Columbier in 2000. It's a rare case. This sort of thing doesn't happen. And then 6 months later, in 2001, the boy in the river turned up, the young boy who'd been trafficked in from Africa via Germany for the purpose of a ritual sacrifice, who was dismembered, and his torso was found washed up on the side of the River Thames. These are not rare cases. We have seen a 47% increase in spiritual and ritual abuse cases in children alone over the last 7 years. If that was knife crime or gun crime, there'd be a whole government initiative on it. And that's what we're trying to push in the National Working Group with members of Parliament like Kim Leadbeater, Alex Sabel, there's a few other MPs as well. And we're trying to get Jess Phillips involved now as well, because what we're saying is this needs to be a priority. Spiritual and ritual abuse report figures are out-reporting FGM reports, they're out-reporting human trafficking reports, and yet it's still not being recognised as a government priority, and it needs to be. The data is there. The survivors have been, and they've told their stories about all different religious and faith and spiritual organizations who abuse them, like the UCKG. We've heard from people in Jehovah's Witnesses who, very similar to what you said about Scientology, they're not allowed to report. I worked with one survivor from the Jewish community a couple of years ago, and she was saying that from around the age of 3, she was sexually abused. And she wasn't allowed to report that. Not that a 3-year-old would know how to necessarily report it, but the way that it was dealt with, went to the Council of Elders, which is made up of men, and she was told, I'm recollecting her words, that if she, it could be avoided, sexual abuse, if at night time she wore a dressing gown, so she wouldn't entice men to want to do things like that to her. Now, she's an adult and she's still part of that community, because what she's doing is she's fighting for change within her own community. She's not walked away. But you mentioned earlier, there are consequences to reporting. Being shunned, mandated shunning it's called, where people in spiritual organizations will be effectively excommunicated. They're not allowed to shop at the shops anymore. They're not allowed to take the children to the same school. They're not allowed to be employed by all people in that same spiritual organization who may be employers. And it's a really difficult place to then be, because you're almost forced back into being part of this spiritual organization. When I was a child, I was brought up Catholic. And until recently, I thought my upbringing was great. I went to Catholic school, and I remember it being, really good. We had to go to church every day. We had to pray every day. I didn't know the prayers when I was really young. And so my best friend David, I remember him sat next to me saying, just put your hands together and go out and just pretend they won't notice. The nuns, though, they did notice. But I soon quickly learnt my prayers. But then I remember when I was about 7 years old, I was naughty in class, and I can't remember what I'd done. But in the classroom, we always had these giant crucifixes on the wall, and they tied me to this crucifix with rope around my wrists, and told me that I had to reflect on the fact that Jesus had given his life for me to be here, and therefore I should reflect on my own behavior. I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I hung from this crucifix in the classroom for about 3 or 4 hours easily. Now, yeah, and I know, but the thing is, I don't remember that as being abusive, because I think at the time it was like, oh, look at me, I'm hung on a crucifix, woohoo. And I remember like pulling faces at the other children in the classroom. But when I do look back on it and I hear other people's stories of survival, actually, yeah, that was wrong. And, tying a child up, tying them hanging from anything really as a form of punishment is wrong. But then, and that's something for me to reflect on still. But then I think I mentioned this to you before, when I went to university, and by this point I had challenged a lot of my own faith beliefs. I didn't understand how Jesus fed 5,000 people. I didn't understand how he walked on water. It's physically not possible. And my logical brain was like, how can science not, it doesn't make sense.
Mm.
And at university, at this point, I turned away from my spirituality. And I tried to explore all the other spiritualities, which one is right for me. And my parents were very supportive of that. They were fine with it. They didn't say, no, you're Catholic, you must stay Catholic. That's it. If you don't stay Catholic, then you're out of the house. And they were very much, my mum especially, was very much of the opinion of go explore, find what's right for you. And that's how it should be. Um, didn't necessarily quite work out because, like I say, at university, I was going through a bit of a bad patch, struggling a little bit, and I had explored all these different spiritualities. None of them made sense. I found good bits in everything, and I was like, well, why can't that just be one thing? Why can't they all just be made up of good bits? Why does it always involve sacrifice or servitude or some sort of punishment if you don't do as you're told? Um, and I was walking down Manchester, a street in Manchester called Deansgate in the city centre, and there was, in fact, a shop. I can't describe it any other way. Sorry, Alex. And it's Scientology.
That's
And
what
it
it
had all,
is. They sell stuff. They want to make money. It is a
yeah,
shop.
but it drew me in, and it had all these books in the windows, and it had
Mm.
all these colourful pictures, and I went in, and immediately somebody was there in front of me. How can I help? And I felt like opening up. I don't know what it was about me. I just started telling them that I'm exploring. I'm in need of spiritual, sort of something, and I'm just exploring. And I don't know if I just wore my heart on my sleeve and gave away too much, but literally, the next thing I remember, and this is like 20 years ago, I was taken into this back room, and there was like a little mini cinema, and I was made to watch. I wasn't made to watch. I was allowed to watch a short film, and I remember it had Tom Cruise on it, Kirstie Alley. I remember Kirstie Alley from Look Who's Talking, and John Travolta, and all these people talking about Scientology. At no point do I remember being told what Scientology actually was. I was just too mesmerized by the celebrity status. I was like, wow, well, if these people are doing it, look how rich and famous they are, then it must be something good. And I do remember that the explanation that I got given later, it kind of made a little bit of sense. I was like, oh, right, okay, so this is more about logical thought processes and what could be real. And then I was allowed to watch another video, and then I went back out to the shop front, and I was talking to a gentleman there, and it felt suddenly awkward to me. It felt like a hard sell. And I was told, you can have this book. Forgive me, I don't know what the correct term for it is. I can only
Dianetics.
That's the one. The
Yeah.
Scientology Bible for as far as
Yeah.
as far as I was concerned, that was their version of a Bible. But yeah,
Mm.
yeah, you're right, that book. And I was like, oh, thank you. And I thought it was free. And I was like, oh, thank you. I'd love to take that away and read it. And they were holding on to it, and they wouldn't let me
I
have it. And,
I
and I was
bet
like,
the next word that came out of his mouth was, "Are you paying by cash or card?"
yeah.
Yeah.
And now I was a student. I didn't even have £20 to my name, let alone the figure that they wanted. And I was
Mhm.
like, you want how much for a book? I
Mhm.
was like, "What? There's no book." I was like, "Is it an antique?" I was like, I was like, I said, "I can go to the local church and literally have a Bible for free. Why do I have to pay not just a £5 or a £10 or even
Mhm.
£20?" But I mean, I think it was like nearly £100, if not more, for this book.
Mhm.
And then they were telling me about the other options that I had available as well, which included, you mentioned that sauna.
Mhm. The
Um,
purification rundown.
Yes, they had one of them in.
Mm.
Now this was a terrace shop on a high street. It wasn't like a big fancy Debenhams or anything. And in their backyard was a shed. That's the only way I can describe it as a shed. And they were saying about this purification process, and I was like, oh yeah, I quite like a sauna, And but again, then came the cost. And I was like, sorry, you want me to pay how much to sit in a shed? And now here's the difference. Because I had had an upbringing where I was allowed to explore different spirituality, I hadn't been brought into that specific spirituality from a young age. I was aware of this felt wrong. and I was aware that I wanted to leave, and I made excuses, and they were very keen not to let me go, but I did manage to leave, and I didn't return, and that was my choice. I have no issue with different spiritualities. I have no issue with beliefs, faiths, superstitions, anything people want to believe in. What I have an issue with is exploitation, and where people use spiritual beliefs to exploit other people. And that's really what drives me as part of the National Working Group. We have the key safeguarding message that we always reinforce, which is challenge the behaviour, not the belief. I'm absolutely almost certain that the Scientology belief in Dianetics, as you reminded me, there's some foundation to that, and I think that the belief connected to that, great, it it caught my attention, and I wanted to go along with it. But then when the added extras came on, I was like, no, why should this cost me? Why should my belief come at a cost financially? Why should I have to pay to believe in what you're selling? That doesn't make sense. You know, and that's where we want to stop. People being financially exploited. If people want to donate, great, that's their choice. If there's a something going on, fantastic. But it shouldn't come at a membership cost, as we see when people come and knock on our doors and saying, "Do you want to join our spiritual organisation?" I used to live in Lancashire, and there was a Mormon temple nearby, and they used to come and knocking on doors literally almost every other week. And I remember talking to them once because I was interested about what it was about. But then they said to me, 50% of your wage or 25% of your wage will come to the spiritual organization. I was like, ooh, why? That's my money. I earned that. Why do I have to give that to you? If I choose to, that's great. And I think the work you do is fantastic. But why do I have to automatically sign over a direct debit giving you 25%? I've got bills to pay.
Yeah.
So spirituality for me is a wonderful thing. I've explored my own. I'm happy with my own, but it doesn't cost me anything. I
Yeah.
don't have to pay a direct debit mandate. I don't have to do as someone tells me every single day. There's no punishments involved. And for me, that's how spirituality should be. It's different for everybody. I get that, but that's really where we want to go. But going back to the original question, mandatory reporting, and we're going to see, there are people being manipulated, controlled, and coerced. It's just pennies just dropped on me. I was being coerced.
Yeah.
That day that I walked into that shop, they were trying to coerce me. I
Yeah.
didn't get coerced, but they were trying to. Now,
Absolutely.
now imagine if there were laws, and one step even further, imagine if there was independent regulation for all spiritual organizations. That is my ultimate goal. That's the ultimate goal of the National Working Group. I saw someone put actually in the chat room recently, just now, sorry, and I'm sorry to pick up on it so early.
No, go for it.
And there's a comment about regulation and church and state. And it's a really interesting topic because in America, the church and state can't be interfered with, they don't cross over. But in the UK, they do. We see many bishops sitting in the House of Lords, where laws are made. So church plays a big part in laws being made. What we would really like to see is true independent regulation, not just independent, truly independent regulation of all spiritual organizations, similar to how the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, um, influences and regulates people in care situations like children's care, adult care, etc. Now, at that same parliamentary reading I told you about back last year with the ICSA report, this conversation was brought up. And one of the spiritual organizations there said, well, we don't believe in independent regulation because they don't understand our culture. So they'd already preempted the fact that any independent body wouldn't be able to understand what they do. And a lot of the audience are like, oh, no, because it's not about culture. Cultural awareness is important, don't get me wrong. But safeguarding is a topic to itself. And all we want is for an independent regulator for all spiritual organizations to make sure that safeguarding is reported, recorded, and managed in a preventative and protective way. Why that needs Why that can't be independent is beyond me. But what we're now seeing is faith organisations, especially, who are setting up their own safeguarding companies to oversight their safeguarding. Now, forgive me if I'm wrong, and I hope this chat room people maybe comment as well. Is that not just marking your own homework?
Yeah. I think it's really important to, like you say, separate the belief from the behavior. And especially when you look at cultic groups, and, you know, I'm going to use Scientology as an example because that's what I know from my own personal experience. It's like, you know, Scientology believe that because it's a totalitarian extremist belief system, they believe Scientology is not just a way of helping the planet, but the only way of helping the planet. And so any problem that you might have, the solution is Scientology. And so just referring back to your experience with the salespeople at the Manchester building, it's church policy to invade your privacy in order to sell you the book, right? I was the director of public book sales at the London church, so my job was to be that salesperson. And the thinking, the rationale behind it is, if I can find out what's ruining your life, it's called your ruin, then it's really easy for me to sell you Scientology or Dianetics as a solution. And I'm doing it because I genuinely believe that it will help you. So it's a necessary evil in a way. We used to have a saying that was, crying is buying. If I can get you to cry, you're buying the book because I've found out the thing that you really want to change about your life. And so it's really easy for me to then go, well, look, it's worth 20 quid, right? Just to at least give it a go, right? Try it. It may or may not help, but I think it will. And all that is manipulation. But you don't realize you're doing it as a Scientologist, because what you think you're doing is helping people. And that's the sort of regulation I think that you're trying to get at, is not looking at the belief or regulating whether or not Scientology helps people. It's looking at the way in which it is practiced and the abuse, therefore, it creates. The same with protecting children, for example. And, you know, talking about experiences for myself, I was locked in a room at one point and told that I couldn't leave until I confessed everything I'd done wrong against the church. Because in Scientology, you believe that you are an immortal spiritual being with more power and ability than anything you could ever imagine. So therefore, you're responsible for everything that happens in your life, which sounds wonderful, very empowering, fantastic. Yeah, I'm a spiritual
I
being.
was about to say that sounds quite
Right.
empowering. I quite like the way you
No,
worded that. You've sold me. I'm in.
well, can you tell I was a salesperson? But
Yes.
the flip side of that is, when something happens to you, for example, you're abused as a child, or, you know, whatever that may be, you're responsible for that. What did you
Oh,
do to pull that in? Because you've put yourself in an environment where you've allowed that to happen. And
oh,
victim blaming and shaming like that is just disgusting. And that's the sort of thing that we need government to intervene to stop happening, because it's all very well and good having a belief, but when you're enforcing it on people in a way that harms them and they're not even aware that it's harming you,
yeah.
that's where the problem is. And especially, just one more point, sorry, I know I'm rambling on, but to tie it up here, is you talked about you know, mandated shunning. In Scientology, the policy is that if you say anything about Scientology negative, anything public, you know, you do anything other than go to church, do your courses, and be a good Scientologist, you're considered an enemy of the church. And the policy is to attack that person. It actually says to destroy a suppressive person, as in an enemy. So there's a big fear and shame of speaking out, or standing up and saying, hey, I don't think this is right. So a lot of Scientologists live in this constant state of fear that there'll be reprisals or repercussions for standing up and saying, hey, I think there's something going wrong here. And so it's this horrible sort of ecosystem. And the only way that I see it changing is government stepping in and saying, look, we're not here to tell you what to believe in. We're
Yeah.
saying, don't lock people in rooms, don't force people to have abortions, don't XYZ. Those are the things that need changing.
It is. Don't sexually abuse children. You know,
Yeah.
don't tell children that it's their fault. And Scientology, I think it's important to recognize it's not the only spiritual organization that is perhaps doing this. You know, as I said earlier, we've seen it in other communities. The conference we had in November, we had I think 16 survivors come and tell their stories from Church of England, from Catholicism, from Jehovah's Witnesses to Islam, Muslim, all who were telling how their spiritual beliefs in their communities led them to being abused. One lady was placed into a forced marriage because her community thought that she was possessed by evil spirits. And the way of getting rid of her was to marry her off at 16. And then her husband believed that she was possessed as well because that's how he had been given her. So he spent years domestically and sexually abusing her. She then gets out of that marriage and she's on the run. And she's still on the run from honor-based abuse. So we see that spiritual abuse is the root cause, right at the heart of all these other acts of abuse that we know so well: domestic abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse, honor-based abuse, FGM, and even trafficking and exploitation, which has seen a huge increase in women being trafficked into the UK for sexual exploitation from Brazil, where the use of Santeria is used, or from China, where Dakini is used, or from Africa with Juju. Every country has its own spiritual identity and belief structures. Some have multiple. But what we're finding is that traffickers are using those spiritual beliefs to target vulnerable people or even non-vulnerable people. You don't have to be vulnerable. You know, they're using their spiritual beliefs against them to then exploit them. They're saying, well, if you don't do this, then you're going to be disobeying your deity, and everyone you know will die of sickness and ill health. And to me and you right now, who have explored many different spiritual beliefs throughout our lives, might think, well, yeah, that's, no, who would believe that? That's not really influential. But just someone who's been brought up in one spiritual belief all their life and doesn't know any different and hasn't seen the rest of the world or understand there's other spiritual beliefs out there, and to be told, if you don't do this, your God, whichever God that may be, will punish you. Right, okay, I best do as I'm told. And that then leads to them being exploited. It's an interesting subject. It really is, but you're absolutely right. It's not about challenging the belief. I would never challenge anyone's beliefs. There are some beliefs and spiritualities out there that I just don't understand. I'll be honest with you. There are some that I think are wonderful. There's some that I don't quite, fully understand. Um, that's my personal opinion. I don't express that as to which is which. I keep that to myself. But I would never challenge someone's belief. I would never go. Imagine if in 2014, and that case, I told you about that case, like landed on my desk about the young boy being abused through ritual harm. Imagine if I'd gone knocking on that door or that family, and they said, "Oh, let's just say we believe in Kendoki, and we think our son's possessed." Imagine if I'd gone, "Well, that's just nonsense. You don't believe in that. Trust me, I'm a Catholic. There's no point believing in that whatsoever." How rude is that? How judgmental is that? And how disrespectful is that for me to just presume that my spiritual beliefs are better than somebody else's and that somebody else's are nonsensical and don't exist and shouldn't be believed? And that's exactly what happened in 2001 in the case of the Adam, the boy in the river. Adam's not even his real name. That's the name the police gave him because they made such serious failings in that case. They went round to people's houses, they knocked on doors, and that community have said to me, they came in our house and we were saying this is part of a multi-murder, it's ritual sacrifice, it's a common belief from where we come from, and the police went, huh, what? Oh, come listen to this. It's all about mumbo jumbo and magic. And the community were like, you don't come into our house and tell us our beliefs and laugh at them in our face and disrespect us so poorly. And that community made a vow right there and then. They said, we will not talk to frontline workers again. We will not help you identify this boy. And every year, it gets to me because every year the Metropolitan Police do an article saying, we'll never give up on Adam. We're always going to keep it an open case. I know you can keep it an open case because that community will never talk to you. You get one chance to safeguard. You get two if you can put the wheel back on after having a mistake and apologizing. That's it. After that, you lose it and you lose all opportunities. And I hear so often police officers saying, This is a cultural thing. We shouldn't get involved. It's not for us to investigate. And I feel for the people who are at risk of safeguarding because they're not getting the opportunity to be protected by law enforcement because those law enforcement officers don't get it. They think it's not something that they should do, and that's not necessarily their fault. And that's one of the things I do through training and development. I've been training on this subject for around at least 10 years now, and we now deliver CPD accredited, independent accredited training. Let's get that word in there.
You're not accrediting yourself then? No.
No. Oh no, I got my friend to set up a company and accredit me. No, it is truly, and it was a hard
Yeah.
slog. It really was because the CPD, who regulate all training, they had never come across spiritual abuse, and so when they were going through the regulation process, what usually takes about 6 weeks, for me took about 6 to 8 months because we said we've got nothing to compare it to. We need to do a lot of work with you on this and meetings, and it did take a lot of work, but we got there and we got the accreditation. And it's still the only independently accredited training on this subject in the UK, and has been for about 5 years. It still amazes me no one else has jumped on this yet, because I do feel like I'm a bit overwhelmed doing it all by myself. But we try and get learning out to frontline professionals so that they are aware, and it works. Just a few months ago, we delivered training to IDVAs, or independent domestic violence advocates, and straight after the training, a lady said, "Can I have a chat with you?" I was like, "Yeah, of course you can." And she said, "I've been out to a house that's involved in domestic abuse, and there's a woman there who's had her hair shaved off, and um, I didn't know what to do. But now, from what you've told me about your training, I'm concerned that that might be something to do with ritual." And we explored it more, and what happened was this lady had gone on Snapchat, and therefore her family had thought she was a witch. And in a lot of communities, cultures, a witch's powers come from having long hair, and the longer the hair, the more powerful a witch. And accusing people of being witches, I'm sorry, it has to stop. You just stop it. If somebody wants to be a witch, fine, but don't accuse them. Don't do what Donald Trump did in his campaign against Kamala Harris. She did great in that debate, but oh no, can't be a woman can't do good. She must be a witch. It's setting us back 400 years. Anyway, sorry.
And I think just to liken that to Scientology for people in the chat, a witch is almost in Scientology like an SP, a suppressive person, right? An enemy, someone who's doing wrong, who's got a dagger behind their back, somebody that just wants bad things to happen to other people. And in Scientology, anybody that, engages in public speaking about Scientology, disavowing abuse or anything like that is considered an SP, and they're branded as such. And I think there's a lot of similarities there, but I think that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But there isn't witches in Scientology, but there's SPs, and there are similarities there.
So that case we took forward, and the social services in that area, and I can't say which one it is, sadly, to protect the people involved, but they said, well, what's the abuse? She lives in a nice house. That's what their reason for not acting was, social services. She lives in a nice house and she's got a nice family, so where's the abuse? Now, the National Working Group weighed in again. We got our partnership agencies from the Home Office to look at this as well. Home Office came back straight away and said, get that woman out right now. She's been trafficked. Okay, she's on our watch list. She's not even part of that family. She has been trafficked for domestic servitude. We knew about, she's had 2 visa applications. She's been declined. She shouldn't even be here. And they came in and weighed in, and it was a whole different ball game. And a lot of agencies were quite embarrassed by the fact that they didn't know enough. They didn't recognize that this was abuse being done through spiritual means. And actually, again, it was that root cause. The spiritual abuse was what was keeping her exploited and had trafficked her into the UK. So learning, understanding, it can only do more good. It helps, and I can't say enough about it, if I'm honest with you. So yeah, great.
And thank you for all of the work that you are doing in this. I think there's one of the things I love about the National Working Group is how it's such a mix of people from different backgrounds. It's not just people from cults, it's people from different agencies as part of government, police forces, local councils and things, all coming together and saying, hey, we recognize that we need to look more at this and understand it better, and everyone's trying to learn more, educate each other, and look at the societal and legislative change that's needed, so that we can protect and safeguard people. And it's definitely a very long road ahead of us and everybody involved, but it's moving, it seems, at least in the right direction.
But it shouldn't be a long road, Alex. It's a really simple solution.
Yeah, don't
Independent.
abuse people. Simple, right?
Well, that would be the ultimate. That's never gonna.
Yeah.
I mean, that's never gonna happen because people are humans, sadly. But independent regulation. And if right now, Alex, me or you or anyone in your chat room could literally go online and register their home as a place of worship. I shouldn't be doing that. Sorry, place of worship, and that's easy to do. I can then charge people £1,000 to come into my house and hear me speak about whatever spirituality I choose.
I'm doing this live stream thing all wrong.
Well, you'd be surprised, and that's where there's no regulation over that. And we see what we call them pop-up churches. We see these a lot, where people will find an empty house, they'll do a pop-up church for a few weeks, do exactly this, and then move on to a different part of the country. Same pop-up church, draws people in, allows them to hear what they need to hear to feel better about themselves, like that you were talking about, that sales pitch, etc. I'm trying to find a way of making people cry to exploit their vulnerabilities, but then charging them, money. It's if we had the independent regulation coming in with the legislation, and there's no reason it couldn't be done at the same time. I imagine how many more people. I imagine that 47% figure of people being abusive, spiritual abuse and ritual abuse would be 10 times that, easily. And that's not something to shy away from. That's something to embrace, because the more people that we can safeguard, the more people can report it. It shows that we're doing good work. I actually think 47% over 6-7 years is quite low. On the grand scheme of things, I think it's a lot higher when you look at that in realistic terms. When you consider 10% of people who are trafficked, there's a question on the National Referral Mechanism form that I put on a few years ago with the Home Office. It says, is your trafficking or exploitation as a result of spiritual and ritual abuse? And in the first year, we saw around 10% of all people trafficked saying, yes, that's how. It's not the actual exploitation I've experienced, but that's how they got me here. That's how they trafficked me. Now, that year we saw 16,936 people going into the NRM. So that's 10% of that is 1,600. And yet when it comes to children, that's 2,180 last year. So already we've doubled the number just by looking at trafficking. Imagine if it was part of domestic abuse and modern slave and forced marriage and honor based, and that question was everywhere, as well as being independent regulation of safeguarding matters of spiritual organizations. So they have to report to someone, they have to do annual reports. If something's a bit skew, well, actually, that's someone who needs an audit. We need to go and have a look at them, because we can't mark our own homework. We shouldn't be marking our own homework. We're not going to learn anything by marking our own homework. We need that independent regulation reinforced as well by statutory legislation. What we need is Jess Phillips is to come to this national working group meeting and hear about what we need. So, if Jess Phillips is listening to this, please do reach out to me, because we've reached out to you many times and we've never heard back. So yeah, get on board.
I've also tried to reach Jess Phillips. She's a difficult one to get a hold of. Fingers crossed she's listening. But well, look,
this
I
should
really
be a
appreciate
priority.
it. Yeah, I agree. And there's also a lot of areas in which things aren't being captured. You mentioned the modern slavery and trafficking statistics there. That's just of the reported cases. Scientology, for example, if you sign your Sea Organization contract, which is a 1 billion year pledge dedicating your eternity to working for the Church of Scientology, you work for the church 7 days a week with no time off. It's certainly indentured servitude. You get paid £50 a week to work 7 days a week, 14, 16-hour days. You get provided food and accommodation, but you don't get anything else other than that. You can be moved anywhere in the world according to Scientology's needs. It fits the criteria for modern slavery. And I personally believe that every Sea organization member is a victim of modern slavery, and anybody who is working in Scientology in the UK as part of the Sea Org and is from abroad is a victim of trafficking. But that almost certainly won't be captured in those statistics because nobody's even looking at Scientology for that. And that's a huge problem, and that's why more work is needed in this area. But I'm conscious of time. Should we go through some of these questions I've been starring and comments as we've
Yeah.
been going through?
There's one that I came across myself. I'm sorry to jump in, Alex. There's
Go
one I've
for it.
come across myself, and it's probably the most recent one. It says, "What steps should someone take when they've reported concerns to law
Yes.
enforcement, but feel that they've been fobbed off?" Okay, this is where the National Working Group really comes into its own, because reach out to us. So you can contact myself. I'll give Alex my contact details. He can by all means put these in the chat room. I know he's got them, or through our website. We can then find the right agencies that we work with, who can then try and positively influence those same law enforcement agencies, like we did with that case that I told you about earlier with the adult lady who had been sexually and financially abused. And we're doing some more work at the moment, I know, with yourself, Alex, regarding some concerns you've had as well. But it's putting in that, helping law enforcement to see what we all see, that this is abuse, and it shouldn't be ignored, and it shouldn't be dismissed for being a cultural issue. So yeah, please do reach out to us. That's what we're here for.
Okay, excellent. All right, Witness here says, thank you, Jordan. In the USA, coercive control is a federal RICO crime. This has been my focus for the cult of Scientology here. Thank you, Jordan. This information is so important to understand, but the RICO part is hard to prove. It needs many people to report. Is that the same in the UK? Like, action is only possible with numbers, or can one person change everything, do you think?
Well, sometimes action is possible with numbers. One person can make a difference. I don't want to jump my own trumpet here, but in 2017, I ran that case. I went to court with it, and about that young boy, I was being suppressed, I suppose, by the judge, who didn't want to hear. He just wanted it to be just a case of abuse. He didn't want any of this, the magical element into it. And I pushed, and it made a difference. So one person can make a difference. The numbers game, though, is also very influential. Even in my role as safeguarding now, I always say to people, report, 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 report. The more times you report something, the less chance agencies can ignore it. So if something's reported once, it could be dismissed if it's reported twice. And we do the same actually with Parliament and MPs, and that's how we get I shouldn't be saying this. That's how we get them on board. If I last year I wrote a letter to Keir Starmer, and I got the usual politician reply of, "Thank you for bringing this to our awareness, blah blah blah." And I knew that I'd got as someone said, the fob off. But then we get 5 people, and this is something we're doing in the National Working Group, to write the same letter from different aspects and different organisations to the same person, and all of a sudden you've got an agenda item. You've got something like, okay, we've got people talking about this now. It's not just one voice. The more voices involved, the greater the influence. And that goes back to, again, the National Working Group. We've got 103 organisations. That's 103 different voices, both individuals and at organisation level. We like to use those voices where we can, where it's going to positively influence safeguarding. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Lupita here says, Jordan, how do you see real accountability happening in institutions that ignored or enable this abuse?
The mandatory reporting. We've brought in this key piece of legislation that says you can't ignore safeguarding at the moment within a child. Well, great. Now make somebody accountable. Show us that there are consequences. Stop. How many domestic homicide reviews do we have a year in the UK? How many serious safeguarding adult reviews do we have each year in the UK? How many child safeguarding boards do we have in the UK? How many people of all those meetings and all those hearings have been held accountable? Not one person. And yet I have been to these meetings where I have heard representatives and the chairs of those meetings telling people that them or their organization is accountable. So what? It's a slap on the wrist. Something that might get published by tomorrow. It's a new story. We need to see serious actions for serious safeguarding protections. You know, you can't just say one thing and then it just be a piece of paper that gets ignored. You know, show us what you mean. You know, show us your teeth.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I agree. Yeah, 100%. Make it, you need to have not threat, but you need to have accountability enshrined in legislation that's not just a news article or some investigation. It needs to be, no, if you do this, then you will be held accountable, i.e. prison time or fines or whatever is deemed appropriate by the judicial system. And the problem we have at the moment is that system just isn't set up. Like we mentioned earlier, the coercive control legislation only applies to domestic settings. So we have a law here that says coercively controlling somebody is illegal, but only in certain circumstances. It's like, well, no, that thing should be illegal in all situations, and have a consequence. And yeah, that change is definitely needed to make sure people are accountable.
Yeah, I mean, mandatory reporting does have a consequence. It carries up to 7 years in prison. Will we ever see that acted upon? I don't think so, if I'm honest with you. I think sometimes our governments, whichever government it is, like to put these sticking plasters on because it keeps us quiet. It makes us feel safe. But, you know, it won't be until something very serious happens that they actually take upon that legislation and carry it out. And yet they've had dozens of opportunities already in the last few years before making the recent amendment. So, yeah, we'll wait and see.
All right, witness here with another great question. Alex or Jordan, what is the statute of limitations for bringing charges for abuses of children? Some do not realize the abuse until much later in life. My understanding is that in the UK, there isn't a statute of limitations. You can report abuse at any point after it happens, right?
You can and you can't. So we have in the UK, this is where my law degree comes in. I was like, oh, I know this. We have summary offences and indictable offences, and then we have tribal either way, which is very similar. So, for example, some driving offences have a 6-month limit on them. Fixed penalty notices, you know, you have 28 days to be prosecuted. If you're not prosecuted, say for being caught on a speed camera, within 28 days of that speed camera, you can't be prosecuted. Summary offences, so low-level assaults, offences that don't carry more than 6 months imprisonment or anything more than a £5,000 fine, tend to be very difficult to bring up much later in life. So, for example, if Alex, if I can use you as an example.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so if Alex, if you'd punched me and caused a bruise to my face when we were both like 5 years old, and I went to the police and said, "Oh, well, Alex hit me when I was 5 years old, and he abused me," the police were like, "No, that's gone past effectively what is the statute of limitations." However, I won't use you for an example of this next one. If, for example, my school teacher had sexually abused me when I was a child, I can still report that because that is an indictable offence and it carries a much heavier sentence and punishment. So indictable offences they don't have any limitations on reporting. Some area offences do have some limitations. So, but when it comes to child abuse, report it. You know, if the worst that can happen is someone will say, actually, no, that's actually run out of time.
Yeah, I think that this is maybe another topic for another day, but I know of cases where people have reported abuse that has happened to them at Scientology's headquarters at St. Hill many decades ago, historic abuse cases, because it's taken so long for that person to come to terms with it, to recognize that it's abuse, and then find the courage to speak up and report it. And the response that this particular individual that I'm referring to got was, it's historic abuse. There's not really much evidence, not really much we can do. We empathize with you, but case closed. And I think that's an example of where greater education needs to happen so that the police force involved really takes it seriously and does follow up with an investigation rather than just looking at it as something that happened a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to get past this word on word evidence I hear all the time. It's word on word. There's no actual evidence. Well, there is evidence. You've got a 999 call. You've got photographs. You've got text messages. There's always evidence. I've never actually come across one case when it is just word on word. There's always something that supports either party in some way or another. So yeah,
Absolutely.
always challenge that, and
Yeah.
then and there are ways to challenge it. There's victim reporting standards. If you want to challenge a legal decision that's been made, you can do that, and it goes through an independent inquiry. So yeah, there's lots of options out there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Vanessa LaRose, thank you so much. Hey, Alex and Jordan, love this topic. I agree. That's why we have Jordan here. D. Thompson here says, I would lay down my life for my daughters. Where are the parents? Why are they not caring for them and putting them first? And can I just respond to this very briefly
Yeah.
first? Is with regard to cults, particularly, is quite often the parents don't realize what they're doing is abusing their children. Obviously, for an outsider looking in with ritual abuse, it's clear to see that this particular action is abusive. But for somebody who is also indoctrinated to believe that what they're doing is helpful, there's no denying what they're doing is abusive, but they don't see it as abusive. So they're not going to report it. And that's why I believe there needs to be an independent regulation type situation, because that's where people can come in and assess the action and point out to these people, you shouldn't be doing this because that behavior is wrong. Your belief is up to you. Am I getting that right? Do you agree, Jordan?
You are. I would come in at a different angle as well, another prong avenue of that one. One of my close friends, her youngest son is autistic and has ADHD. She's known this since he was a very young boy, and for years and years, she has, in her words, suffered. When he loses control of his emotions, he will trash the house. He will beat her up, and this was when he was 5 or 6 years old. And she used to beg social services, please, I need an assessment, I need a diagnosis. I think he's got autism and ADHD. As a mother, she knew. She begged the school. She begged the GP. She was told for nearly 10 years, it's just a phase. He'll grow out of it. Honestly, it's just a phase. When he was 11 years old, he got a diagnosis and he was put on medication, and it changed him. Um, Now, I used to babysit for him, and he's a lovely kid. He really is. But it terrified me. She used to have to lock herself in her own bedroom when he became into this, what she called an episode. That's how she referred to it. She'd come around to my house with a black eye, and I'd be like, "What happened to you? Has your husband hit you?" She went, "Oh no, it's my 4-year-old." I was like, "What?" No knives were allowed to be in the house because if you got them, it would be game over. But he didn't know what he was doing, and the statutory agencies that were there to support her as a parent weren't helping. They were, as someone said earlier, fobbing her off.
Mhm.
And she's been on my training, and she said, "You know what, Jordan? If someone turned up on my doorstep at the exact right time, I've been locked in my own bedroom, hiding from my 5-year-old son, who has trashed my house again, who has beaten me black and blue. And they said, knock, knock, knock. Hello, Mrs. Smith. And Sonny having some problems with his son. We have a magical cure for him. £5,000, it'll cure him." She went, "I'd be very tempted." Just through sheer desperation and love to help her child and also help the family unit. And she says, and that's where the abuse comes in. It's people being targeted when they're at the most vulnerable,
Mm.
and then financially manipulated, potentially even sexually abused, physically abused, because people are normal. We want to find and help other people. So there are a lot of parents out there that think that what they're doing is for the children's own good.
Mm.
And they're not seeing that it's being harmful abuse because they've been told that it's completely good for them. So I think sometimes you have to take on the air of caution. I understand, I'd lay my life down for children as well, but I'd also be desperate enough to do anything I possibly could to safeguard a child, even
Yeah.
if that means looking into different holistic therapies that maybe not be quite the norm.
Mm.
But being in such a situation of desperation that I'm not thinking clearly.
Yeah, and that's the problem with cults is exploiting people's vulnerabilities, which is the policy in Scientology, like I explained earlier, is find out what's ruining your life and then use this as pitching it as the solution, and then that becomes abusive. And
Yeah. When you
anyway,
told me
yeah,
when you told me that, I was like, oh my goodness, I felt like when you told me that, and I told you about obviously what happened in Manchester, I realized I was like, because I started off by telling you, I was in a bad place and I just stumbled across this Scientology shop, and when you said actually that's the mechanism of what even you were trained to do, it made me feel really uneasy,
Yeah.
knowing that actually I thought, because I thought I'd got away from potential exploitation, but actually I walked into what I potentially now look back on. I put myself in a very vulnerable situation without realizing it, thinking that I was somewhere safe and that these people cared for me. And maybe their intentions were to care for me, but as long as I signed over a check for a lot of money first. So,
Exactly, exactly.
yeah.
All right, final question here, because I know we are massively over time. Amy M says, comment, I just took a mandated reporter class for my nursing license renewal, and they didn't talk nothing about addressing religious or cult abuse.
Wow.
What are your thoughts, Jordan?
Well, listen, the NHS have been one of my biggest training providers that I deliver training to up and down the country. So by all means, reach out to me. Let's get some training in there. Let's help them realize that mandatory reporting can include and should include, cults, spiritual abuse, ritualistic abuse as well. Hospitals are the people that see this the most, because a lot of time when people have been spiritually or ritually abused, it involves very specific indicators, burns to specific parts of the body, restraint marks, cuts to the back that are usually like a 1 inch long, things that me and Alex can't see when we're walking down the street. But as a doctor, a nurse, a medical professional, you can see them because people are in a different situation where their bodies get examined, and you need to have the tools to recognize that actually I recognize this. I've been on some training and learning about this, or I watched a documentary. I know what those marks mean. Um, I know
And
what these
mental health
words.
as well, right? The coercive control aspect, right? Those signs that aren't necessarily physical, that somebody is afraid of speaking out or afraid of telling the truth, or being coerced. There are numerous cases in Scientology where Lisa McPherson, for example, she was checked into a this was in America, checked into a psychiatric ward because she was having a psychotic break, and was checked out by Scientology and said, we'll look after her. And she was coerced into saying this is what she wants. She wants
Yeah,
Scientology to look after her, not the psychiatrists. And she was then, put in solitary confinement and later tragically passed away. There were no physical signs at that point in time when she showed up at the hospital of abuse, but the coercive control, the mental side of things absolutely were there. And if there was more training done, and doctors, psychiatrists were aware of the signs that someone is being manipulated and exploited, perhaps we would have had a different outcome.
yeah, you're absolutely right, Alex. You're absolutely right. Mental health teams are a key part of the National Working Group, as you well know, and the stories we hear from them in a lot of cultures and communities, like you said, mentioned Scientology, but a lot of others as well. Mental health is the worst type of shame you can bring upon your community. And mental health practitioners tell us that families turn up in the belief that the person isn't mentally unwell. They're possessed by evil spirits, because that isn't as dishonorable as being mentally unwell. So they'll turn up with all sorts of tools and practices at the clinics, etc., trying to get to the patients or get them out as a different mechanism to what they think is supporting them. But it all comes down to honor and beliefs, and again, spirituality. It's got a lot to answer for what we believe in, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been fascinating, intriguing, heartbreaking in other ways. And I think it just goes to show the importance of the work that you are doing and others in this community, and why the National Working Group exists, and your company, Prism Training, and the important work that you're doing, educating people on this issue. And thank you for that. And I hope we can continue to work together and collaborate as a community to do what we can to make the difference that's needed here.
We will. Thank you. And listen, Alex, thank you. And thank you to everyone who's come on today, and for listening to me talk. And thank you for the opportunity today, Alex. It's been an honor, and I very much look forward to working with you even more in the future than we already have done. So, yeah, big thank you for
Alrighty.
today.
Thank you, Jordan. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we'll see you on the next one.